Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Modern Meathead Experience. Today, we're going to be having a conversation about prehab and specifically the problems associated with prehab and many other training related concepts that are kind of similar in nature. So, for those of you who don't know, prehab is a word that people use to describe something that is similar to rehab, but applied very differently or at a different time. So when people say that I'm doing rehab training, what they mean is I'm doing some form of training after a time period in which I've incurred an injury or some kind of discomfort or pain, like after the fact. And prehab is just basically rehab, but before, or at least that's kind of the way that I often hear it, most often hear it used. So prehab might be like before I bench press, I'm going to do some rotator cuff exercises, or before I do leg training, I'll like activate my abs or activate my glutes or something like that. Those are kind of all concepts that fall underneath of the umbrella of prehab. And today, I want to sort of talk about that concept as a whole, and specifically, I think the flaws associated with just the what sort of underlies the thinking there. So, just to kind of start things off, before I hand it to you, Ethan, my thoughts on this, I think, are most clear through analogy. And you let me know, Ethan, if this is clear to you, because if it's not clear to you, then it will certainly not be clear to most people. So like if you're driving a car, right? And, um, you know, over time, as most cars do, they kind of wear down, specifically like in the tires, right? So, you're driving on flat roads most of the time with like minimal pothole, like really well paved roads. Like the wear and tear on the tires is fairly low over time relative to like if you're driving in, a city. There's a lot of potholes, a lot of crap on the ground. Maybe the roads aren't too good. We're driving over a bunch of crap all the time. So you're driving in both cases, right? But like in one case, you could be driving on a road that's kind of fucking up the tires quickly, and in another case, you might be driving on a road that is really really easy on the tires, smooth on the tires. And so, regardless of sort of where, or I'll say, regardless of which situation you're in, the tires are going to wear down, right? In the same way that like joints incur stress, muscles incur stress over time and training. And so, at some point in the car situation, like you're going to have to replace your tires, right? But the rate at which you replace your tires will depend on sort of where you're driving and sort of what the quality of the tire is. And this concept of prehab to me, um, oftentimes feels like it's an attempt to, put patches on the tires or put protective layers over the tires, or to sort of just maybe buy bigger tires, right? Or attempt to buy, higher quality tires, all the while just spending tons of time driving on shitty roads. Right. So if you could, choose two roads and one of them has 50 potholes, per mile, and the other has zero. One of them has all this, like gravel on top of it, rocks on top of it. The other is nice and smooth. It makes sense to me to take the smooth, route. And a lot of times what I find is people in their training, what they're doing is the sort of equivalent of like driving on all these shitty roads. And then to kind of make up for the fact that they're driving on the shitty roads, they're putting band-aids on their tires, and or maybe they're having to sort of replace their tires, quote unquote, more frequently. When in reality they could have just taken another route. And so I think oftentimes people perceive the whole concept of prehab as something that is necessary, specifically because they view training as inevitably damaging, right? It kind of the energy underneath of the whole idea says to me that people view lifting as this thing that is going to create damage, and I kind of need to protect myself from damage before I do it. And then something like, let's say, like stretching after a workout might be a sort of similar thing, right? It's like a prehab, but just after the workout. And so fundamentally, it comes down to this idea to me that like people imagine that training always needs to be the equivalent of driving on this bumpy, shitty road that has been really worn down. And they can't possibly imagine a world in which the ride could be at all smooth, right? It's like, oh, if I train triceps, then it's normal for my elbows to kind of bother me after I train. If I do the bench press, it's normal for me to feel shoulder pain after the session or even during the session. And so people having had these experiences their whole lives, I think just get into the habit of assuming that training is inherently bad or dangerous or damaging, and therefore we need to kind of buttress our training on either end with these exercises that are sort of purported to be magical or mystical or healing in some way, in the same way that we could just simply, purchase higher quality tires or replace them on a frequent basis. So, with all that said, Ethan, I kind of want to direct it to you. Does that, as an overall explanation, concept, view, make sense to you? And if it does, what kind of comes up for you first when thinking about all these sort of prehab concepts?
I think it cuts to the chase a lot faster than where mine goes because I tend to do the like Cheesecake Factory menu thing where I think about all the things like I recognize the things I don't want and kind of start very broadly. Just
Mhm.
like what meal are we eating in the first place? Like
Yeah.
what macros am I trying to get out of it? Like all the stuff we talked a little bit on the last podcast. We used the food analogy. So it's the same thing here. Like I just start more broadly than it's probably even useful for the podcast, but it helps gives me like solid ground to stand on. I mean, the word rehabilitation I've heard forever. At some point someone had to make up that word. But when I type it in on Google or in notes or whatever, I don't get a little red underline underneath it. So I know it's a word that's been around for a while.
Yeah.
When I type in prehabilitation, it does have that line. So then the next thought was like, well, is it used at all in the literature? Like if we just go to like, PubMed or Google Scholar and I type in prehabilitation, like is it a word? Like new words are created all the time, right? I don't think it has to be something that you can like look up in the dictionary to be something that's useful or used colloquially. I always have trouble with that word for whatever.
Colloquially? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to really
Yeah.
emphasize the W, even though there's no W.
Okay.
Colloquially.
We'll work on that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it is actually like it does actually show up in some studies, and I was just pulling those up here. And Prehabilitation for patients undergoing orthopedic surgery, another surgery for the knee, cancer yeah, undergoing cancer surgery. Um, yeah, they're mostly surgery related and basically sort of like disease um, and or some type of like we're doing something that's not ideal. We know what's happening anyway. We're going to cut into you. We're going to cause some type of damage. Is there anything we can do ahead of time to make the recovery process better? So that's a starting place for me, both in terms of just how I used it, hear it used in the gym colloquially. No, didn't get it.
A little closer. A little closer.
But then also, how it's described in research. So in my mind, I kind of start with like, all right, rehabilitation is a word I've heard a lot. There's a lot more studies with that word in the title. Where do we see this show up? And as you mentioned, the fact that it's sort of it's happening after the fact. And what are we trying to do? We're trying to return to baseline. So in this case, if someone's getting cut into, we're trying to get back to where they were, before the surgery or potentially beyond that, ideally if we're fixing something with the surgery. But there's some point in which we're trying to return to. So then I ask, well, how did we get there in the first place? Like how did we break something? And typically it's either an acute incident or sort of a chronic buildup over time. So was it an accident? Was it a car crash? Was it a collision in sport? Was it something that, in a sense, was almost unavoidable? And now we have to get back to prior performance. Like for our context, I think sport is a fine example because we're sort of close to that in terms of what we're talking about here. So we have some unavoidable accident, that happens on the field. How do we get the player back onto the field, not in pain? But then there's also, even in sport, these sort of like chronic overuse injuries, right? They've just built up over time. And how do those happen? Is it also unavoidable that we're just doing a thing that is inherently negative for us, but we have to do it anyway? So we're just doing this repeated activity. Maybe we're not built particularly well for it. Maybe genetically, like it's our, it's more about our anthropometrics and maybe just like the different limb lengths, or maybe the structure of our joint, maybe the rate at which certain tissues heal for us. Any number of things predispose us to not being able to handle a particular stress well. Like, would I do well swinging a golf club or throwing a baseball? Like at this point, certainly not. But would I have ever been an MLB pitcher, or a PGA golfer? Unlikely. Um, so there are those incidents where it's just like we're doing something repeatedly, which we were sort of just not built to handle and maybe not prepared to handle. So there's the other side of it of, are we just incurring too much too fast? In terms of like the chronic side, the acute side, in which is sort of unavoidable, it's an accident. Now we're more into athletic training off the bat than we are sort of physical therapy, or this chronic overuse of a thing that we sort of know isn't great for us, but we have to do anyway, versus this thing that like could be tolerable, but we have these things we can manage. So we can manage our technique. How am I throwing this baseball? How am I swinging this golf club? How am I making my cut on the football field? And then there's also how much of it are we doing? And those oftentimes are both modifiable factors. So when it comes to the world that we're most likely speaking to, we're talking about resistance training on this podcast. And you have people who are sort of doing it for leisure, where they might be focused on specific lifts just because those things, for whatever reason, are interesting, fun, and exciting for them. And they might also be trying to put on some muscle mass. But then on other two sides of the spectrum, if we're simply talking about strength sports, it might be a high degree of specificity in something like powerlifting or Olympic lifting, or even specific events in strongman that are part of the sport, or a very low degree of specificity in something like bodybuilding, where there's many roads to Rome. So I think those are kind of the populations we're talking about. And within those populations, there are a lot more modifiable factors than there are when we're just talking about sport. Because in sport, it's basically like you have this thing that you need to do repetitively. Are you, did you pick the right parents for it? Can we modify the sort of total load or volume that you're incurring of that thing? And then can we modify the technique to make each one a little bit less negative? And then if we do get to the stage where we need rehabilitation, ultimately, what is it that we're affecting? We're affecting tissues, and we need those things to adapt. And how do we get them to adapt? Basically by varying amounts of intensity and duration. So how much load are we using, and how long are we doing it for? That might also change the velocity. So at a fixed time and zero distance, it looks like an isometric, and we're just pushing into something from a given joint position. At a different time and a different velocity, it might look like a plyometric. But it's this whole range of, basically, we have a specific tissue we're trying to load it through a specific range. And then we have the intensity and the duration in which we're doing it for. And that sort of makes up um, these things that we call resistance training, plyometrics, et cetera, which ultimately are the spectrum both of rehabilitation and also this thing that we're calling prehabilitation, which is essentially like you are trying to prevent an injury, you're trying to prevent pain. In this case, when we talk about pain, we're really just looking at it through the biological side of things, the tissue side of things. And what tools do we really have in our toolbox to affect that biological side in terms of adapting tissue? It's all the things I just mentioned. All the same things we do on the rehabilitation side are the things that we would do to prevent injury. So whether you're an athlete, whether you're a person in the Gen Pop, or whether you're a professional powerlifter or a strongman, it just comes down to what's the specificity of the thing you're trying to do. And ultimately, within that, there are specific demands, and we are just preparing tissues for those demands, again, at specific intensities, durations, joint positions. So ultimately, where I think this conversation goes is specificity. And then the question is like, is there anything like when we were talking about sport or just these sort of unavoidable accidents, is there anything about lifting that is inherently negative or creating a situation where we need to do these other things to prepare us for exercise? And I think that's kind of the direction you're going with that. So just long-winded way of kind of coming full circle to like, here is the spectrum of where this of what we do beforehand to what we do after the fact, and how essentially they're just the same thing packaged a little bit differently.
Mhm. Right. And so I mean, this reminds me of the conversation that we had off camera, off recording this week. I brought up the idea of just how people view implements as completely distinct from one another. So people view a barbell as this thing in this category that's all the way over here, and people view machines in a category that's all the way over here. People view cables in a different category, dumbbells in a different category, and although there are differences between implements in terms of what maybe they're better for or worse for in terms of exercise selection, ultimately all of them are implements that we use to load our bodies in one way or another. And so in the same sense, when we categorize things based on prehab or training or rehab, these are all seen as categories that are very distinct from one another, but ultimately, in every case, we are applying load to our bodies in some way, shape, or form that might be different in magnitude or intensity or duration, as you mentioned, but that all ultimately can be considered as sort of being in the same bucket of here I am, I'm loading my body, I'm loading tissues, and I'm potentially creating some kind of adaptation um, in doing so. Does that kind of is that kind of along the lines that you were describing?
No, it's just simply where am I? Where do I want to go? And what can I adapt to at this moment?
Right. Yeah. So, okay, so with that understanding, then the well, first of all, I think that just with that understanding, I think that the picture is completely different. It's like now we're looking through a totally different lens, right? In the same way that, people view stretching as inherently different as lifting, right? It's in some sense, yeah, again, there are differences in qualities and what you might use that for. But fundamentally, we're talking about just creating some kind of or imposing some kind of external load against which we're resisting. Again, the variance and duration, intensity are all relevant, but to view those things as categorically distinct, I think, is an error, and an error that leads to a lot of um, sort of misguided decision making in the training process, and ultimately a lot of wasted time, I think. So,
This is
into
why I often come back in our conversations to just realizing like us existing here on planet Earth and resisting gravity, we sort of take that for granted, right? Like we take
yeah,
for granted that like yeah, bodybuilders have more muscle, but people who have never lifted in their life still have a fair amount of skeletal muscle tissue. So we think about it as like, oh, how many reps short of failure, do I need to train in order to hypertrophy muscle? It's like most of the people walking this earth have, never done a thing to failure, in their life as far as like what you would typically picture as a resistance training exercise. But even in daily life, even if you went for a hike, you went for a walk outside, you get on and off a chair, it's clearly not necessary, to impose the levels of stress that we do in order to create some adaptation. Because I think people tend to think of it as binary. It's almost like, well, if I don't eat, this amount of protein or this amount of leucine, or I don't do this amount of sets, like nothing happens. And clearly, just being alive, something happens. So understanding sort of like the full spectrum, like the full continuum of like, what is the sort of like base zero that we're starting from here? And just, ambulating, like just locomotion throughout the day and like doing activities of daily living, like it clearly creates adaptation by itself. So that's kind of the starting place, and you can get less than it. Like you can be bedridden, you can lose those things. So the idea that these adaptations are always occurring, on some spectrum, and it's just sort of meeting the next threshold is important, especially when we're comparing now these words that we use from training to rehab to prehab, just understanding that no matter what, like the organism still has the same basic goals, and we're imposing our desires upon that organism, but it's still responding based on the same rules. Understanding that premise, I think, is always important to come back to, versus when we put like a sport or resistance training in a box and don't look at it through the broader lens of biology.
Mhm. I had a really masochistic thought, which would be, if you think that like doing a set of leg extensions to failure is painful, imagine how painful it would be for someone to do a set of sitting to failure. Like imagine if you just like sat in the same, like how long could you just sit in the same position, unmoving? It's really painful. Like it's real, like the amount of discomfort one can create just by not moving from the same position is, I think that kind of discomfort is way more difficult to deal with, just as a tangent,
It
than anything
changed
in
the
resistance
duration
training.
for sure.
Say it again.
It changed the duration for
Yeah.
sure. It's like imagining a marathon versus a sprint in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see glimpses of this with like, sitting on a plane or like sitting in the car and then literally being fucked up for like the next day. You're like, man, my lower back from just like sitting on a plane for 13 hours is just, you need a couple days to like, recover from that stuff. But anyway, uh, sort of getting back on track here. Um, we come to this statement, which perhaps I should have started with, which is um, this concept that good training, however we may define that, appropriate training is or checks the box of prehab and rehab simultaneously. In other words, I think that what people, whether recreational lifter, bodybuilding in the extremes of bodybuilding there may be some caveats that we need to make for that. But like, the average person who is listening to this or the average person who is a recreational lifter, I think that what people should be attempting to move toward is a program that consists of exercises that feel good in the immediate term and for as long as possible. Um, and people should strive to move in the direction of needing to do less before their workout, less after their workout, um, and and less sort of in between sets. Like I even see people who are doing like these kinds of exercises between sets so that they can continue to do the thing that is hurting them. Right? It's like the classic. bench presser at the gym that I go to. Is like they finish a set of bench press and I see them kind of getting up and like moving their shoulder around, rubbing something, right? And then maybe they go over to a wall and stretch the thing so that they don't feel the sensation, right? All these things to me, at least many of these things, are not done with a specific goal or intention in mind. Like most of this stuff just seems to be this this strategy to remove the current discomforts or unwanted sensations that people are generating through their training. And so to me, it's kind of like, okay, um, if I have a problem, let's say, in my romantic relationship, I'm going to try to just first address the problem at the level of a discussion. People who are watching will love this. Um, I'm going to first attempt to address that problem at the level of a conversation with me and my fiance, right? I'm not usually going to go to talk to this friend or this cousin or that or this my brother or whoever else. I'm gonna address it sort of at bottom and then see, okay, like, do I need to maybe do other things or course correct from there? um, do you think that that is a sensible thing to expect of like people who are recreationally lifting? Do you think that it is appropriate to say that one should work toward getting to a place where they don't need to do these things before their training session? Or can you kind of maybe think of an application or a steel man in favor of these sorts of modalities? Again, outside the context, let's say, of like extreme or rather high level sport, higher level bodybuilding.
So I often start these conversations with a lot of theory that just looks at the concept through a broad lens, but might be hard for the person actually that you're describing, like in their shoes, to really grasp and say, okay, like I get it, but what do I do on Tuesday, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Probably change for you and I. It's useful. It lays a framework for people that maybe are already making some of the right decisions. They can nod their head and understand. But I could also see it not being that helpful for the person you just described. So trying to speak to that person in terms of like, where is their head at? Why are they making the decisions they're at? And also like just being a little bit humble and saying like, look, we've both done this before.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
easy for us now to say like, oh, that's like, why would you think that way? It's clearly not logical. But most of the decisions we make are not particularly logical. And there, again, coming back to biology, there are good biological reasons for why we do what we do. It's not always useful, but it's pretty ubiquitous and pretty predictable how we find ourselves where we do. So, with that being said, we've both been in that position. I can remember doing lots of different coursework and lots of different like three-letter acronym courses and thinking about how can I bulletproof myself with the physical therapy field so that I can better survive my training, both by, doing, 30 plus minutes of, prehab or corrective exercise, as it was called, um, or on my off days from training, my quote unquote recovery. So the massage there, whether it was chiropractic early on or massage therapy later or even different peptides that people are using now and red light and ice. I watch the show Hard Knocks about the football teams now and they're in season and some of the guys will get 3 hours of massage a few times a week and they'll get it in a red light room and then they'll go in the cryotherapy chamber. And this was all stuff, being someone that was, hyper motivated and had a really specific goal. I wanted to employ as many useful modalities and any, leg up that I could get. So the mindset certainly was like, if I could, spend another 30 minutes before training or hour, whatever I have to do, I don't care how much time it takes. Like I remember when I was playing football, I would do yoga. It was just like these were the initial steps. Like the first time I hurt myself, I went to a doctor, and the doctor moved my shoulder around, did some orthopedic testing. Eventually, we got an MRI, and eventually, I cut into both shoulders. I got surgery on both sides. That's probably the first thing people think is, I something hurts, I'm going to go to a doctor, and they're going to use the tools that they have. They may or may not do orthopedic testing. They'll likely image it if it's been around for a while, and then you have medications to reduce the inflammation, reduce the pain, and eventually mechanical, interventions to change the tissues. So then you start getting exposed to, like, well, maybe if I moved a little bit better, or I didn't have these inadequacies, then I wouldn't get hurt. And there are things that I just wasn't prepared for. So then you might find yourself in chiropractic and physical therapy. And, I went to school for exercise science and spent a lot of time in the physical therapy world, both working in that world, shadowing people, traveling to different seminars, and just trying to utilize their secrets to allow myself to do more of the thing that I love doing, thinking that, my experience is that I keep getting hurt doing this thing. So clearly I'm inadequate somewhere. I need to bolster, I need to do more, working harder, doing more, finding things that other people aren't doing. That's been the route to get me to where I am. So I need to keep finding more and more things uh, to add on that, the others aren't doing, because that's how I'm going to get ahead. And then as I mentioned before, as I started to become more financially successful, then I would have access to weekly or biweekly manual therapy interventions of various different sorts. And the idea that you could do things like using temperature change, or using light, or using supplements to speed the recovery process. And it can allow you a lot of times to push past certain points where you get to, sort of a fork in the road, or an impasse, and getting the right manual therapy, or using certain things to allow you to get around the pain. Even cortisone injections were a thing for me for a while. Might allow you for a time to keep doing what you're doing without making significant changes to your behavior. So I can certainly sympathize with being in those shoes, of sort of not seeing this greater picture of the basic concept being that if you're doing something which is causing a problem, or you're creating a pain, or something is breaking down, the very first thing you need to investigate is not, what am I lacking? What can I do more of? But what am I currently doing that is creating this problem in the first place? And I think a lot of times the story for some of these other professions is that what we are doing is inherently negative, and that lifting weights itself is somehow dysfunctional, or somehow going to create problems if we don't counterbalance it. So, to address that, for one, we discussed the idea of, what is lifting? What do we even call that? Like, all we're saying is we're moving a joint through a specific range, and we're loading that at a specific intensity. We're doing that for a specific duration. And when you put all that together, it's really no different than any of the rehab stuff. It's just different iterations, different tunings of those dials. So I think fundamentally, one, the idea that, like, resistance training is something fundamentally different, is a misnomer. But then, two, the idea that to survive a specific thing better, you need to do the opposite, I think is also false. Um, I think you need to tune a specific um, thing, whether it be a person or a machine, to be good at the task that you want it to be good at. And you don't get to be good at everything all at once. So if we're sticking with the car analogies here, we could say like, well, if you take a dump truck to the racetrack, it's probably not going to perform particularly well for particularly long. And vice versa, if you take a race car and you try to load it up a bunch and get it to haul stuff around, it's also not going to survive that particularly well. So fundamentally, you, based on your parents, your genetics, like you are going to fall somewhere along that spectrum. There are things that you're going to survive better than other things. Um, but then from there, you make decisions based on what you enjoy. And with that, you do have to make sacrifices and say, what am I trying to create here? What do I want this car to do? And most of us will be somewhere in the middle. But if I say I want to be an IFBB open professional bodybuilder, I don't also get to be a tennis player. I don't also get to be a golfer, as we mentioned earlier. So, what is the task specificity of an IFBB bodybuilder? It's to stand there and look good. And I just need to be able to sit in a chair without pain, to be able to take my 10, 15,000 steps, not get, cardiovascular disease, et cetera, et cetera. There are some things that like, there are some basic things that I need to do in life to make money, to do my job, just basic activities of daily living, but they're pretty low threshold. I don't need to go out and do what another professional athlete needs to be able to do. So at the extremes, you really need to pick who you want to be and what you want to do. But even at a lesser scale, even if we don't take that to the most extreme, you still have to say, like, what am I trying to create here? Do I want to run really fast? Or do I want to do that for really long? Do I want to be really muscular or do I want to be really flexible? And they're not all 100% at ends with each other, but to some degree, if you just train for the specific thing you want, there's nothing inherently bad about that. Me walking around and looking muscular doesn't create more injury potential unless I try to do something vastly outside of my capabilities. So I'll pause there for a second, but the two major points were just that when we step outside of the resistance training world per se, sometimes it's easy to look at these other modalities as distinctly different, and inherently they're not. They follow the same principles. And the second one being that we need to train specifically for what we're trying to create. And in doing so, it's not inherently negative. There is nothing that makes a person more injury prone by training one way or another, as long as that training by itself is not loading tissues in a way that's crossing the tipping point, either through some combination of the loading of the specific reps, so the exercise selection, the execution, but then on top of that, the total volume that they're doing. As long as the training itself is not specifically causing, accumulated tissue damage, there's nothing inherently injurious about creating a dump truck or a race car. You just got to do race car things and dump truck things.
Yeah. So I think this is a good time in the last sort of segment of the podcast here to talk then about how we can practically translate this to specific um uh you know cases that you and I potentially have dealt with. I think that would be useful just to talk specifics about, you know, on just at bottom in exercise, like what we might recommend as just sort of general bits of advice about, hey, if you're, if you're someone who's generally in pain a lot, or you have this specific kind of pain, what can you do about it? I think starting big and working more granular, I'll kind of give some examples and then I'll hand it to you if you want to add things just based on your experience in training yourself and also clients. The first thing I would say is across all exercises, you should make the assumption that if something hurts with lower loads, that it's probably going to get worse with higher loads. I think that's a safe assumption. In other words, if you're warming up and you're like, oh, my shoulder feels like crap with this variation, um, just simply adding more load or waiting for adrenaline to sort of kick in, waiting for the beat drop inside your headphones to help you through that, right? Take a minute to look at the exercise you're doing and say, what are some subtle adjustments, visually subtle adjustments that I can make to this that might help this particular pain that I have. So let's say you're doing a dumbbell press, right? It could be you changing the width of your arm path. Does a wide thing hurt? Okay, let's see how something slightly more narrow feels. It could be changing the orientation of your forearms, right? So does facing my palms away from my face not feel great? All right, let's see how it feels to kind of turn the dumbbells facing one another. Um, Additional things might be a subtle angle change, right? So am I using a 45-degree angle? Okay, let's see how a 30 feels, or let's see how a 25 or a 20 feels. What about the range of motion? Does it only hurt in the bottom position? Okay, maybe just, for today, I'll stop shy of where it seems to be problematic, and let's see if over time, that problematic position can no longer be that way. And it's also perfectly fine to never get to that, point. Maybe it's just something that based on your structure or whatever other collection of factors is not going to work out for you. So that's kind of a generalized way you can go about troubleshooting these things. But again, principally, the idea is to not accept any kind of discomfort that you perceive to be abnormal, right? So there are obvious discomforts like a muscle fatiguing, right? That's kind of what we're after. That's obviously a different kind of discomfort, one that is distinct from the kind that I'm describing. Or the kind that I'm describing is more obviously like, this joint. It's people usually say this joint or there's something they have to kind of rub, something that they kind of have to shimmy around every time they experience it. Those are the kinds of discomforts that I'm talking about. So aside from that specific example, you can extrapolate that to a lot of different exercises. So if you're doing like a cable rope push down and your elbow is bothering you, right? Now, of course, you no longer have the same kinds of considerations in terms of the specifics that you did in the dumbbell press. But principally you do, right? So you could see how tucking your arms into your sides, does that feel better? Does it feel better to flare your elbows and your arms out? The grip on the rope, maybe you can change the orientation of your hands and maybe pointing them down feels better than pointing them together or vice versa. Potentially stepping closer to the cable might feel better. Stepping away from the cable might feel better. Um, right. Changing sort of the orientation of your arms altogether. All those things are in principle the same, but just in terms of application can be different. Same thing goes with the range of motion. Same thing potentially can be said of tempo and those sorts of things. But again, overarching principles are just don't assume that if something starts out feeling like crap, that it's just going to just get better over time. Like I think it's certainly possible that you have certain kinds of uh, tightnesses that you may have certain tightnesses going into a session, and you may just need to sort of warm up to feel less restricted. I think that is something that is a separate conversation to be had. But to me, it's much more obvious when there are certain kinds of pains that are normal, just a part of being human. Like I just got to kind of get moving, versus this is something that will, you know, after a certain period of time become much more problematic for me. So, um, and then one more thing that I'll say is just a lot of I think what plagues people in this regard is just the concept that we were discussing before, the view that exercises exist within these hyper specific categories, i.e., a barbell does this thing, but a dumbbell over here does this thing, and a machine over here does this thing. I think it's very important to remove the dogma around specific exercises and exercise names. And I think that just opening your mind to things that look similar but are different is very important. So, bench press doesn't feel good. That's okay. We have this machine chest press over here. Oh, this machine chest press over here doesn't feel great. Let's see how this chest fly feels, right? Just being willing and able to make those kinds of um, pivots, I think, whether it's on the daily or whether it's just when you're changing exercises after whatever you like to call a block of training. I think it's very important to, in the same way that you're willing to kind of make those micro adjustments within an exercise, to make adjustments across exercise. And again, I think it's important not to settle for just like living with the discomfort and assuming that at some point it's just going to magically get better. Or again, to this whole discussion, assuming that your quote unquote bulletproofing, activities before and after training are going to be the thing to be able to sustain you. So, Ethan, in terms of like specifics, that you find that you have found most helpful in your training, um, whether it's like implement specific or just exercise specific in terms of actual exercise themselves, or anything else. What are the sort of things that are top of mind to you, that you feel like would be the kind of biggest movers for the average person to sort of help them navigate these kinds of aches, pains, niggles?
Actually think for the average person and even the above average person, um, what they do the rest of the day is at least 50% of the picture. So, as I was mentioning earlier about just walking around on planet Earth and how we create adaptations that way as well, that duration component's a big one. So, even for myself, I think I estimated last podcast, I'm lifting weights for something like 10 hours a week. That's still 10 hours, that's not even half a day, right? So we have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I'm only lifting for 10 of those. And then when you say the average person, I mean, how many hours is, I say the above average person, just meaning like the person on this podcast is certainly listening to this podcast is certainly not the average person,
Yeah.
right? But the average person listening to this podcast is still, in like the 90th percentile. But for them, maybe they're still only lifting, 5, 6 hours a week. So the intensity is there relative to the rest of the week. And by intensity, you could think of that as effort, you could think of that as load, but it's a hell of a lot different than just, go and making your breakfast, right? Very low intensity, but these are long duration things we're doing all day long. And I see that stuff add up um, about as frequently as the training stuff does, particularly as you move closer and closer to the general population. But as I mentioned, even in the elite, sometimes like that ends up being the one thing that they're not really considering. And they are paying more attention to the training, but less to the rest of the day.
Mm.
So starting, with the first thing, that happens in the morning, you get out of a bed. What kind of bed did you sleep in? Is that bed really soft and you sink down into the mattress? For some people, that might be great. For others, that might create their pain. The pillow they're sleeping on, like what's their shoulder position when they do that? How does that affect things? In general, we've mentioned, we kind of joked before on the podcast about some people will get out of bed and talk about how their sleeping position, is what drove their pain. And sometimes that's true, but oftentimes it is also just the behaviors throughout the day, their training behaviors, and simply that they were just kind of in a static position all night long, there is some fluid shifts happening overnight, and they might just realize that pain as they wake up in the morning. But then from there, do you start your day with a brisk walk, or do you sit down right at your computer? You get on a train or get in a car. That has an influence right there. Even your nutrition and the quality of your micronutrition will affect your ability to recover. But then as we move throughout the day, are you working from home? What kind of chair do you sit in? How often do you get up and take a walk? Are you mindful of how you're picking things up? Are you mindful if you have a painful shoulder, elbow, knee, back, whatever it is? Are you constantly looking for that pain? Are you constantly picking the scab and just trying to see if it's still there? Or are you actually trying to avoid it and get small wins? That's what I would recommend is creating an adaptation, whether it's neurological or whether it's more at the tissue level. It's not about crossing the tipping point and finding that pain. It's about staying below that and creating adaptation. So it's about constantly winning. And winning is not finding that pain. Winning is making the shot. Winning is successfully playing the piece. It's not necessarily about failing. Sometimes we fail to know where the boundaries are, but failing is not the goal per se um, when it comes to learning specifically.
Like, we want to drink to get drunk, but we don't want to black out. Once we black out, we've gone at least one step too far. We want to get to the point where we recall the night, but not to the point. Not, but by virtue of experimentation, we might say, okay, well, this is where I know that I'll probably black out. So let me just, stay shy of that.
Yeah, and I think that's a better way to approach it, right? It's just like know that it takes you, 12 drinks to get to that point, and you can go to 10. And then you plan for that. And sometimes you'll be wrong, but it's really about being a professional and planning your day. If this is your goal, if this is the adaptation, if this is the person you want to become, set yourself up for that, measure it, observe it, and this idea of sensing pain and thinking of it as something that's happening to you that you need to get rid of, I think is the wrong mentality. And that's when we say, all right, I need to foam roll it, I need to put a lacrosse ball, I need to get a massage, I need to get an injection, I need to shine a light on it. You name your thing. Even I need to do this, glute rotator cuff, whatever exercise to make me feel better, before I go do this thing. The pain is not there to punish you. The pain is there to teach you. And when you look at it as something that's happening to you as this negative experience that's being brought on from the outside, you try to find ways to rid yourself of it. But it's actually there for your survival. It's actually there as a teacher, whether it be subtle or very gross, whether it just be a little sensation that you feel in your gut or whether it be a sharp pain that you feel in your shoulder. It's there to instruct you. And that might sound kind of like esoteric, but it's a really important point, which is that we're supposed to listen to it. It's supposed to help you make better decisions. So trying to numb that, specifically thinking I'm trying to get rid of this pain is not the approach. The approach has to be, why is my body sending me this signal? It's telling me that I've done something wrong. We're not trying to quell the signal. We're trying to listen to the signal because it's being helpful. It's being instructive to us. And then the way that we carry out our day, the way that we do our exercise is all based on what kind of adaptation we're trying to create. And ultimately, like you mentioned with the drinking, where are those tipping points? How many minutes can I sit? How long of a walk can I go on? How long can I stay in bed? What is the firmness of the chair? All these little things are influencing our biology. And quite honestly, it's not simple when it comes to modifying the exercises or modifying your day. I mean, it's tough to know in the first place, like, what adaptation am I trying to create? What are the tenets that make up uh, the ability to create that adaptation? And how is it influenced by my activities of daily living? What's the right amount? These are hard. Like there is science there, and there is personal experience, and it's easy to say, well, just observe it. But a lot of times, the subjectivity in observing something is really difficult. You get up and you say, okay, I'm hurt. What was it that I did yesterday? I tried to have the same day 5 days in a row, but inevitably I didn't. Yesterday I'm not me, but imaginary person was hanging Christmas lights. And the day before that, they went on a 2 mile walk because their friend, really wanted to talk through a relationship or so, so thinking that you're going to have the same day is sort of like thinking that every training cycle is going to be the same, and that when we switch from one tricep exercise to the next tricep exercise, we'll know, oh, that one was better for growth. Too many things changed. So I sympathize again with the fact that this is not easy. This is a never ending process of investigation. So I think we don't want to frame it as, oh, it's just so simple as like, if this tricep exercise doesn't work, you should know immediately which one to switch to. Those are things that we put a lot of time into investigating and that feel like intuition to us, but sometimes are difficult for the average above average person.
Yeah, so a couple of things I want to capitalize on there. The first is that I don't really drink. So just if anyone was curious, this is not I've had one really bad experience, and I'm not advocating for the blacking out concept, just as a useful analogy and as a caveat there for me to mention. Um, the the other thing that I think is really important to take away from that is that um, one of the things that makes the process of identifying sort of what seems to be helping or what seems to be making things worse is just the fact that, you know, on day one of a program, a solution that you find may not be the solution for day 100 of a program. You may, for instance, like we see this a lot with you, Ethan, where you will not experience certain issues when you introduce an exercise that later come up once you've scaled the load by 100% maybe, or as is not rare for you. And so different issues can kind of crop up, no, not only for the same exercises at different times, but then also like what changes you need to make to an exercise may impact another exercise. Like is the change that I made over here adding more load or taking more load away from this joint, which may, and how does that relate to other things? So you have, a single exercise which changes in its influence and its effect over time, but then you also have the concept of how that exercise affects all other exercises, which are also potentially changing over time. And so I agree that it's just this constant sort of like ebb and flow that is in large part like unpredictable. Like, sure, you can, you know, be as calculated as one could be about tracking and about paying attention to one side. You got your journal, you're writing down like, hey, how do I feel in the morning? How do I feel after training, pre-training? You can track all that stuff, and inevitably things will continue to change. And so I think it's really good that you brought that up because that is probably one of the biggest challenges of all this. Um, I wanted to just mention because I would be remiss if I didn't sort of tack this on to this conversation. I think that a big help for me personally, I think that you could say the same, outside of just paying attention to and learning more about the sort of principles of exercise setup and execution and anatomy and all those things. One of the biggest movers, like orthopedically for me, has been this whole anchoring concept, right? Creating external stability to, uh, you know, essentially limit motion and force that we don't want in an exercise, and to sort of promote the kinds of motions and forces that we do want in an exercise. So just to kind of give people an example to orient ourselves here, an example of an anchor in an exercise is, using a thigh pad on a leg curl. or putting your arm up against the bench to do a curl. And as is the case with many of these concepts around exercise, people tend to only view things now through the lens of like, well, how much growth does this cause in 8 weeks or something? They pull up a study, this thing caused more growth than this thing, therefore I'm going to use this thing. And one of the major considerations that I think is really under discussed is just like, well, how survivable is this thing? Because as we've talked about, like more is more. Oftentimes the things that cause more growth are just they just simply allow us to create more force in the same, number of reps or across the same number of reps. And so when we're looking at exercise selection and execution, and we're looking at this concept of anchoring specifically, people tend to only look at the anchoring stuff through the lens of, well, how much output can I create in the target muscle? But what people often, I think, neglect in that conversation is how much force am I taking away from other things that I'm going to train tomorrow or that I trained yesterday, right? So to use the biceps curl example, I think people really underestimate how much force they're putting through their shoulder girdle over the course of, let's say, 50 to 100 reps in, let's say an arm session, right? If you're going to do like three exercises for biceps, let's just call it 3 sets of 10 on every exercise, right? You're doing almost 100 reps of different curls, and every single rep, yeah, it's primarily, at least hopefully, going to make your biceps a rate limiter in all those cases. But what about each of those 100 odd reps that were also adding stress and fatigue to, your shoulders or potentially your elbows in a way that you didn't want, or potentially your hands and your forearms in a way that you didn't want. And so I think just as an overarching concept, the idea of anchoring and being really precise about what you're trying to do with an exercise is helpful from the perspective of, yeah, I'm going to put more energy into this thing that I want to grow, but I'm also going to take away potential stimulus, or really what I'll call potential stress, from joints that I don't want to be involved, And so we see this a lot with like the sort of the typical like barbell dogmatist who's just using a barbell like at every chance they can get. And so you end up with a bunch of exercises that on their own, in theory are super growth promoting, but it's like, okay, I'm doing bent over rows, and then I'm doing back squats, and then I'm doing RDLs, and then I'm doing barbell curls, and then I'm doing, skull crushers with the bar. It's like all these things are adding more load to much more than just the tissue that you're trying to target. In this case, people a lot of times end up doing like, I don't know, 30 plus sets of like spinal erectors and like abdominal training, just like all the stimulus that will go through their spine. And when they take a look at each individual exercise, they're not seeing that kind of discomfort crop up in any individual instance. But then when you look at all the different things they're doing, it's like, oh, every exercise I'm doing is like some kind of trunk exercise, you know? So these kinds of things, as you're saying, they're definitely not simple, because to be able to see that across a program, you need to know what each individual thing is doing. But I think that those are other things to keep in mind. And specifically as it relates to the anchoring and the external stability concept, the idea that you're taking away stress from areas you don't want to train is as relevant as the idea that you are stressing areas more that you do want to train. And I think that, and you can speak to this, Ethan, I think that that has been especially helpful for you in kind of minimizing the overlap in tissues like the erectors and the abdominals, to kind of mitigate, low back stress over the course of not just a single session, but a week, months, years, right? Which eventually makes things much more, I think, sustainable. So, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that aspect of things from just maybe like a personal example as it relates to the anchoring concepts? Oh, you're on mute. E. You're still on mute. You're still on mute.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, yeah.
I would agree that both over the long term, in terms of just uh, how I feel block to block, but also within an exercise, subjectively, how it feels, at ever increasing loads, that the anchoring is a huge concept that seems to reduce the perception of discomfort over time and just those chronic aches and pains. Really, anything that is able to isolate and make specific the direction of loading and the magnitude of loading that we want at a given joint angle, I think is really helpful. Basically, anything we can do to match our body's output, the direction that it wants to move, with the forces that the implement are creating, seems to be really the most sustainable approach over time. So I will often take it even a step further, where I will have a partner give a little bit of assistance on an exercise, or I'll use another hand if I'm doing a unilateral exercise, and one that can modify the resistance profile in a non-linear fashion, meaning that it can change throughout the set. So maybe on the first rep, and it usually there's no help on the first rep. It sort of depends on the machine. If the machine is built in a way where it's the best option that I have orthopedically, but it's really heavy short, and I'm particularly weak in that short position, then maybe right off the bat, I'll have the partner assist into the short position. But if it's an exercise that's a little bit more favorable from a resistance profile standpoint, maybe the partner won't assist till midway or three quarters. But either way, they're able to kind of give a an amount of assistance that varies each rep based on the amount of basically the need that I have at any specific point in that rep. And I think just smoothing that out, both from the standpoint of resistance profile, but also minimizing any sorts of other motions within that rep. So if I'm using a cable and I'm moving through a hinge joint, and let's say I'm doing curls, not having the cable pull me into internal or external rotation, and just keeping that force as sort of a sagittal plane force through the elbow, I find that to be hugely beneficial as far as sustainability. And then as I'm pulling, having that resistance profile being matched every single rep, because what I need again on the first rep or the fifth rep might not be the same on the 10th rep. But when I'm just pushing, when I'm focused on giving my best effort within the constraints that are given for that target muscle, and I never have to wiggle, I never have to adjust myself, I never have to create some type of unwanted force in my body to get through a sticking point, or to manage a direction that I'm being pulled by the implement outside of the direction I'm trying to load these tissues and train this joint through. It would seem intuitively and also subjectively that this is the um, most survivable way, to train a given muscle, and at that specific joint.
Yeah, and one of the things there that I've taken from you is you kind of like to start exercises generally, if practical, from like the shortest position rather than so a good example might be like when you do like like the triceps, like a single arm triceps exercise, you will pull out the cable with both hands, which is obviously um, relatively a lot easier than just using one. And then you, let's say, extend fully to where you're going to finish, and you kind of start the exercise with the eccentric portion so that you can know beforehand that, like, okay, I'm in the position that I want to end in, and therefore I'm going to kind of work backwards from there rather than pulling your arm out with, first of all, pulling it out with a single arm, which is going to be a lot harder than compared to two arms, and then starting from a concentric uh, contraction that might not be exactly in line with where you're actually, going to end up. And the same obviously could be true for a curl or many other motions. Obviously there are some motions that start that way, right? So like a free weight squat, you start from the fully contracted position, if we'll call it that, and you can kind of lower down. But even in those instances, I think starting from the more lengthened position can be helpful. So like, let's say you're in like a Smith machine. Um, I actually oftentimes, let's say if I'm doing like a Smith machine press, I tend to, at least in terms of my initial setup of the exercise, I like to start the exercise from the bottom on my warm-up sets to make sure that the bottom position is the one that's kind of optimized for. And then once you kind of know that, like, okay, this is the position that I'm going to end up in the bottom, then you can kind of start from a position in the top where, especially with a Smith machine, you know that every time you're going to be sort of just striking the exact target that you want to strike. Whereas if you just put a bunch of weight on, start from the top and guess as to where the bottom might feel good, there's a lot lower chance of success that way in terms of just setting things up appropriately for you right out of the gate. So, I like that we kind of touch both ends of the spectrum here, super broad and more specific. Is there anything else that you kind of feel like you wanted to touch on here, or do you feel like that kind of has covered most of it? All right, cool. So for those of you who are still listening, shout out to you. There's a Modern Meathead holiday sale going on right now. So if you want to grab the exercise library at a discount, please feel free to do that. Support the Modern Meathead Experience, and hope everyone has a good holiday. And we will see you all next week.